Welcome back to 100 Lunches. Today we are joined by David Weber, the founder and principal architect of Weber Studio in Austin, Texas. Known for his award-winning designs, David has helped shape the world of architecture since founding his firm in 1997. David, we are so excited to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure. It's great to be here. Wow, that sounded way more formal than I was expecting, but wonderful. I'm okay with that.
Well, that's okay. We'll get like eased in and relaxed now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm super informal, so yeah, don't be shocked.
Well, David, I don't know if you know this, but you hold a little special place in our hearts because 10 years ago, when we started Etch, we reached out to a number of architects, builders, real estate agents, and, made cold calls. We emailed. You were the only person that agreed to meet with us.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. In fact, you might have been the only person that actually answered the phone.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I thought you were okay. Well, thank you for telling me that. I've actually been told that before. Every time been told something like that, I'm shocked. I'm like, I'm the only person that spoke to you? That's so wild.
Kind of crazy, right?
Yeah. Well, we've always adored you because of that. And I think that speaks to who you are as a person. And we, I think, have similar values and just the way that we approach things. And people call us all the time. We're like, sure, it's always worth a conversation. It's always, you just never know where one conversation will lead. And so we're grateful for that. Okay. Easing into it. Will you start with your childhood? Tell us where you grew up and what your early passions in life were.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is going to be a short answer so I was born and raised in Austin.
Okay.
And it's not that interesting actually. My dad and mom both grew up in Missouri. My mom was this sort of loud, very smart, young from a Jewish family. Father was a tailor, went to, very urbane, lived in St. Louis. And my father came from a small town in Southwest Missouri, a lot more salt of the earth folks. His mom happened to be Jewish too. I don't know if that has anything to do with him ultimately making his way to the big city. I think a lot of people who grew up in small towns make their way to the big city. So he ended up at Washington University, where he met my mom, and he went to grad school. You're asking about me, but I'm telling you about my parents. That's kind of fun. So we're a very close family.
Yeah.
Anyway, they lived in St. Louis and they went to Chicago, and then my dad did his postdoc in London, and then ultimately when he was done with all of his schooling, they had to figure out a place to go and live. And so my dad got a really great teaching position at University of Texas here, and so they made their way to Austin, and that's why I was born and raised here. And I tell you all that because in a weird way, I grew up in when Austin was a very different city. I was born in 1968. It was such a different world back then. And I had a family background that didn't really match up with Austin anyway. And yet it kind of made sense. It was just this little hippie day. So bottom line, I was born and raised in Austin and and had a wonderful upbringing, essentially hanging out on UT campus a lot of my youth. And that was when the UT campus student population was 20% of the entire metro area of Austin.
Wow.
I don't know. Now the UT campus, 50,000 people out of 2.5 million. It's 2%, or is that right, of the entire population of the metro area. And once upon a time, it was 20%. So culturally, it's just been a really different city. It was a different city in the past growing up than it is now. So anyway, that shaped that sort of very laid back, very easy place to grow up, where everybody kind of knew each other. It was very small townish. And it was very outdoorsy. We grew up in Barton Springs. My mother used to sit on the rocks at the end of Barton Springs. We'd sit with our towels, and she'd have a bag with snacks and goodies and smoker cigarettes while all three kids, we were all splashing around in Barton Springs. It was pretty magical childhood. And then being on UT campus with all that education and erudition, like all that intellectual energy combined with this real, I always describe this real white trash trailer park sort of hippie upbringing in the same town. It was somehow we got all this richness in a small city at the same time. So I don't know. That answered where I came from. Now, what are my passions? I don't know, architecture. Somehow I knew from early on, I just want to be an architect. I think from even before when I was 4 years old. Well, probably what triggered it is when I was 4 years old, my parents hired A.D. Stinger. And for those of us who've been around Austin for a long time, we know that A.D. Stinger was one of the preeminent architects, mid-century modernist architects of this whole region or this whole area. And now everybody talks about how great his houses are and what a big influence he was. Well, my parents hired AD to design their house. And so I remember at the age of 3, 4, walking around the construction site and just being, I just thought it was so cool. Yeah. And I think that probably triggered my interest in becoming an architect. And from that point forward, I used to always talk about, I always wanted to be an architect. So I guess that's where it came from. But, I like law. I like foreign languages. I like music. We've always dabbled in a lot of things. This is, again, growing up with a family with two smartest shit parents. So we just had a lot of influence going on growing up and a lot of exposure to arts and otherworldly things. And so we had our interests peaked in a lot of different ways. And I remember at some point as I was growing up thinking, well, I've got to pick something. And I sure love architecture. I mean, I knew I was going to be an architect, but I always laughed that even though I was certain I want to be an architect, it's not like I had to pick it. I knew I wanted to be that. I felt like I had all these fallbacks that I was never going to use because I knew I wanted to be an architect. So, anyway.
Oh, interesting.
I hope that answered the question. It's boring. Yeah. It was a really boring answer. It took me a long time to answer. But
what did your siblings end up doing or choosing?
Well, this is odd. My sister taught. She actually works here with me. She might even be hearing me have this discussion right now. So my sister, who we always joke was the one who actually raised us, because my mother used to sit and read her books and smoke cigarettes and sunbathe all day, and my sister would actually make snacks for us and get us set up for TV. We had a great childhood. I mean, my sister was wonderful, but she ended up she was always an artist and ended up becoming an art teacher. For a while, she taught French as well. Again, foreign languages is this thing that we have in our family, because growing up, we lived in Austin our whole lives. We did live in Switzerland for a while and in France for a little while. So we got to live other places a little bit. So she did education, not real different than my dad. He was an educator as a professor. And my brother used to say he used to not quite know what he wanted to do. And I used to think everybody know what they wanted to be when they grew up. And I learned from my sister and brother that wasn't necessarily the case, that I was actually a rarity in that regard. But my brother, he was always good at business stuff and science, and he was amazing at interacting with people. He still is. He's great at interacting with people. So he ended up becoming one of those people who combined science and people, and now he is a great communicator about science and technology and energy. So he's a kind of a preeminent scholar in the country about energy and policy. He's actually quite famous, my brother. So so he does that. I don't know, that was probably really complicated. He does energy and he's an energy and he's a science. Like Neil deGrasse Tyson, the scientist that actually is approachable. My brother's a Neil deGrasse Tyson type.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, I want to skip back for a minute. You said you lived in Switzerland and France. Talk to us about that for a minute, because that's so cool.
It is really cool, actually. So I was, it's funny. I always loved the idea of living somewhere brings back. So my dad, being a university professor, he was in the early 1980s when we were kind of in our teens. He was either granted a sabbatical or he applied for a sabbatical to go do. And this is not uncommon. Professors will go do a sabbatical in another university somewhere else in the world for usually half a year or a year and do a research project. And so that's what he did. And he picked the École Polytechnique Fédérale Lausanne, which is in Lausanne, Switzerland, which is a really great science university and chemistry university because he's a chemist, physical chemist. So he got his sabbatical assignment there, or he picked his sabbatical assignment there. And so we all lived in Switzerland, in Lausanne, Switzerland, for half a year. And what was really great about it is my dad was going there for science and education and all that stuff, academia. But my mother, when she wasn't smoking and listening to opera really loudly, she was like, well, I want the kids to learn how to speak another language, and I want them to learn how to do all this other, understand another culture. So again, she had that very urbane mindedness that comes from growing up in a city like St. Louis about wanting us to go see the world, see culture and stuff like that. So
how old were you?
So that's how we ended up there. I was 14. And then my dad liked that stint so much that a few years later, he wanted to do a shorter one, but we did a summer in Paris where he did Université de Paris or Orsay. I always joke, should I say it in American pronunciation in French or should I do the French? So we were in Orsay where he did a little summer-long research project there. So we actually lived in Paris for a summer as well. That wasn't too shabby.
Yeah. Not.
And Jessica, I'm glad you asked though, because those had incredibly deep impact on us as kids growing up. One of the it's so funny. One of the reasons was because when we were in Paris, my mother was actually in this horrible depression, and we all lived in this tiny apartment. We got a little choked up, which is weird because I'm dead inside. So we lived in this tiny apartment, all five of us.
Yeah.
And we were sort of forced to interact with each other in a way that caused us to develop these new family patterns that were really pretty great.
Yeah.
So weird.
I love that so much.
Pardon me. All right. So
good.
Anyway, that was great. That was great. And then but the thing that was really interesting about living in Switzerland, for example, when I was 14, is I grew up thinking, oh, Texas is so ugly. It's this dry, deserty, all the trees are sort of scraggly, and it's not very pretty.
Yeah.
And Europe is beautiful. I mean, Switzerland is gorgeous. Germany, we got to travel around a bit. I went down to the south of France where it was it kind of looked like Texas a little bit. And then, but still a little different. And then when we came back, I was like, oh my God, well, there's no place in the world that looks quite like Texas. It actually kind of is beautiful. And as I've aged, I've discovered how weirdly beautiful a place as ugly as Texas can be. I'm one of these people that actually loves driving. We have a project in Midland, and I love driving out to Midland because right outside Midland, it's actually definitely not pretty. But for a lot of that flat, dry, barren drive, it's got just the right shape of the land with the way the sun hits it. It's really beautiful, and the vegetation, it's really quite beautiful. But I think I'm one of like 7 people in the entire state that likes that. So, but all that is because of this influence from having lived in these other places and being exposed. So,
absolutely. Well, Stephanie and I both did study abroads when we were in college.
Oh, wow.
And I have to say that time, I was in Florence during my time abroad. I was there for a month and a half, and we traveled all over Italy. And I look back at that time in my life as honestly some of the best memories that I could ever have. And it's
poor
just
baby. A month? You said a month and a half?
A month and a half, yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, it was just incredible though. And Florence will always hold a very special place in my heart. I took my husband back there when we were expecting our first child. We did a little baby moon, and I took him to Florence and got to show him all around. And like, I think I could still know exactly how to get to my apartment, to my, where my school was. Like, I know the path in my head, like back and forth, and it's just, I don't know, very special to me. So I love that.
It's weird when you can develop an ability to have a home in a different place that's nothing like where you grew up, and suddenly you discover that you carry that with you, and you can connect yourself to anywhere you are, and you carry it with you, that you're not as stuck in one place as we often think we are. Stephanie, where did you go?
Same, Italy.
Oh, okay. Where, in Florence?
We didn't know each other. We didn't know each other. Okay. Yeah. We were in Rome and Florence for the most part.
Yeah. So those are so amazing. I did a study abroad, or I did an internship program when I was in college in Australia for 8 months. And that blew my mind also. Again, all these different places you go in the world. And the one thing I keep coming back to is they're all the same. Like, people are the same everywhere. We just have a different context around us a little. And it's only a slight difference of context. It's not even that dramatic a context difference. And then I did a travel study program when I was in college also, where we traveled around a lot of Europe to look at a lot of different sites. And again, I mean, that told me I never wanted to be on a bus with 45 people for a long stretch of time. But more importantly, I just seeing all these different places, you discover how dumb we are as humans in humanity by getting upset about things that don't matter. And really, we're all kind of just the same. And so anyway,
it's very true.
That's all the philosophy I'm doing today. That's it. I'm tapped out for the week.
That's the line. Well, we're kind of skipping ahead. We'll have to come back to this part, but I'm curious how that has impacted your career, because it seems like you've done work outside of the United States, and how has that all played in to your career in terms of things outside the United States?
Well, we have 4 core values as an office, and many, they came from me just kind of getting anxious many years ago and trying to sit down and figure out where the hell did all these designs that we work on come from? What is the common thread? And so I actually spent couple of months over one summer just analyzing all the work and thinking through it. And the trend lines I discover was functionalism, expressionism, regionalism, and minimalism. And so I ultimately want to say that those all came from these experiences I had. And I'll start with regionalism, for example. This sounds like I'm trying to sell a firm. I'm actually not, but it's foundational to who I am as a person. But I think what I discovered is that every place I've ever gone, there's a quality of that place that's unique. It's not always dramatically different from other places, but where the south of France looks like Texas in some ways, there's some nuances that make it really special in the south of France versus Texas. And so I think it taught me to really hone in on a place and really focus in on what the magic of that place is. So that's where this sort of regionalist streak comes from. I think the functionalist kind of mentality that I've always had is because I grew up in a family. We didn't have we were middle class. My dad was a professor. My mom worked when we were growing up. It was normal. We didn't grow up in a super wealthy environment, and we had the exposure to a lot of different socioeconomic folks in the world, and ultimately discovered that there's a lot of excess that always made us feel a little uncomfortable. Made me feel uncomfortable when some people were barely getting by. And at the end of the day, some of the most wonderful stuff was the stuff that was just purely functional because it was solving the problem and it wasn't trying to be more than that. And so that has been really why I've been so focused on functionality and just the notion of not throwing stuff away. My parents were born in the Great Depression, seeing how a lot of people in the world have a lot and a lot and many more people don't have enough, it just made me really conservative in terms of not wanting to throw stuff away. So those two things are real anchors to our general set of values. And then what's interesting to me is, and I think this is where, I don't know if I have to tie the 4 core values to this, but I feel like it's so ingrained. So there's a lot of the minimalism we do in the architecture, and where that term comes from and what we do is because a lot of architecture, it is sort of excessive also. It's just decorative. It's not like there's an interior designer, you might appreciate this. There's an interior designer in town that I think is really talented, but we once worked on a project with him, and he's very funny too. And we were asking some technical questions. He was like, I don't know, I'm just a decorator. And it was kind of funny. And he kind of was a decorator. He's a really, really good decorator, but it helped me, that helped kind of boiled it down for me that there are decorators and there are designers. And as an architect, I'm a designer. I am solving problems, and I'm not decorating. And I think a lot of architecture, unfortunately, is decorating. And I just over time discovered that there's so many problems that have to be solved in what we do in our mutual fields. Because the interior design and architecture, to me, they're kind of part of the same continuum. But we're solving problems, and it's not decorating. And I think that's where that minimalism comes from, is I think a lot of times things that are not minimal are decorating, and things that are minimal are the result of solving problems, and that's it. Now, I'm starting to develop a huge love of things that are more decorative, because I'm also discovering that a lot of, especially older architecture, a lot of the decoration was functional because it was trying to tell a story to an illiterate population. So I'm intrigued by that the stories that tell. And I think we're finding that sometimes we're introducing more decoration into our projects because they're supposed to solve a specific problem. But even so, I would still define that as minimalism. Anyway, and then the one thing that I would say is also really interesting to me is the unique voice of unique people. I hope this is not super crazy boring, but I'm diving into this thing. So there are a lot of architects in the 1930s that did like these super rationalist, and it still goes on today, where they do these super rationalist boxes and everything is super rational, and that's it. But that's not what we're just big, lumpy, dumb, balding, fat apes that have a whole bunch of things we have to do every day, and feed our kids and take them to school, and clean up poop in the backyard of the dog. Like it's not that pure. And so I love the idea, but the thing that is really interesting about humans is that we do have this ability to organize. And so how do we as humans want to organize everything and structure everything, but then still allow it to have a little bit of that reflection of how we're all idiosyncratic as well. And that's where this notion of expressionism comes from, is how do you have structure, but also allow it to be a little bit kooky. So anyway, so all of this was derived from, I think a lot of it is just who I am as a person, but a lot of it was really driven hard by our exposure to a lot of the excess that exists in the world, and a lot of the lack of stuff. Anyway, there you go. I hope that answered that question. But
yeah, I like your isms. Those are good isms.
Me too.
Well, I like them too. But the thing that's the most interesting, though, is that it's really something that's been great for us to grab onto as a firm.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember, but one of our clients from the past, Irfan and Seema, that's it. Seema actually at one point said, "Oh, I really love your Functionalism, Expressionism. She actually was one of the very first clients to actually repeat that back to me.
Yeah.
Because she saw it in an ad. And I think we've discovered that over the years is that people like something to grab onto. It gives them a starting point, and it helps us in the firm every day. It helps us with our client. Anyway, so I'm glad you like them too. Thank you.
I do.
Do y'all have any isms? I'm dying to know what it's hard to sit down and figure out what are we all about. Have y'all done that before?
We had this whole exercise that we had to go through and like pick like words of things, and I'd have to pull it up, and we'll do that afterwards. We'll tell you what isms are.
Yeah, it is awkward as hell to state to the world what you're about, and so practicing how you talk about it is so important. And I'm in a lot of situations where, and I know this stuff through and through, but there are lots of times I'm with somebody and they're like, "Oh, what are y'all about? What kind of work are you into?" And it just sounds so pretentious. Like, well, we follow a consistent process to get a unique outcome.
Right.
I mean, I do this whole, and I'm like, that sounds kooky as crap.
Yeah.
So
you're like, really?
It is. Yeah, it's hard to talk about what it is.
So ours, we actually have 6, and we have them in phrases instead of specific words. So the first one is we strive for excellence. We believe that the designs should create joy. We trust intuition. We believe in harmony. We lead with integrity, and we're relationship focused.
Joy,
intuition,
integrity,
joy, intuition, integrity, excellence,
harmony, and relationships.
Okay. The relationships is the one I'm automatically going to forget. I'm not a relationship. I have no relationships with people. I'm a loner. So, except for my husband. So he has to put up with me.
Well, and he works with you too, right?
Yeah, he does. But we're not nepotistic. Just ask my sister. She's 2 desks over. She can tell you we're not nepotistic.
That's so funny.
And we were trying to get my nephew to come and do a little bit of work with us, but ransom and stuff.
Family affair.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, well, will you go back and tell us from college, what was your path to then deciding to start your own firm?
Oh, wow, this is kind of crazy. I started my firm when I was 29, which is kind of wild, especially if you look at how far we have not gotten since then. But anyway, we did okay. But so I started it young, and the way I got there was, so when I was in college, we had to pay for our own college. So even though my dad taught at UT, we didn't get any breaks on tuition or anything. We had to pay just as much as everybody else, which is a real weird thing about that university.
I'm surprised by that.
Yeah. And furthermore, my parents not only didn't have enough money to put us through school, or maybe they did, but they just insisted that we pay our own way. I think my dad was tired of seeing a whole bunch of students that didn't want to be in university classes. And he was like, I'm not going to spend money on it. If they want to do it, they should spend money on it. But that sounds more like my mom being that, anyway, the two of them decided that we had to pay our own way through college. And so we all worked all the way through college, and I had lots of different jobs. We all worked as waiters or cooks in restaurants because those always pay pretty well. But I really wanted to start working in an architecture firm. So I worked in a design firm for a local guy named Gregory Free, who's actually an interior designer, not an architect, but did a lot of architectural-ish projects. So I worked with him, and then at one point, while I was still in college, I started dating this woman who came from a little bit of family money. She had her own money, and she was 5 years older, and she was an artist, and she owned a house. She wanted me to help her design a studio for her in her backyard. So I actually, as a student, did a real live project that got built while I was in college. And so I had this weird jump on a lot of my peers in the real world. And then when I got done with college, and then I worked for Heather McKinney of McKinney York Architects in town. I worked with her, I think before I got out of college a little bit too. And we always worked a lot growing up, and I was real eager to be in my career. So I just had these jobs, and for a bunch of different reasons, I worked for Heather McKinney and Robert Steinbaumer and Barnes Gramatsky Kasarik, and then like Flato. And I think I would say there are interesting stories around all the different stints I had at these different locations, and how in those days, you would bounce around a little bit from firm to firm, because somebody would be slow and say, hey, can you give David some work for, a few months? And then we'd go back to where we were originally. It was a lot more, was more like, a whole bunch of kids in a playground and different parents watching over them type of thing.
That's so different interesting.
World. Yeah.
And then I ended up in Dick Clark's office as my last stint before I had this really strange opportunity to start my own firm. And so I ended up working for Dick Clark for 6 weeks total. As long as you were in Florence. I worked for him for 6 weeks. 3 weeks into my stint with him, I gave him 3 weeks notice that I was leaving to start my own firm. And I was like, Dick, I don't know if it's even going to work out. If it doesn't work out, I'd love to talk to you about coming back in a year or so. And he looked at me, he's like, you're going to do fine. Yeah. And that was 27 years ago. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
So that was it. But the whole situation around how I started the firm was the odd thing. And that's a whole story I can share with you. I don't know if this is the right time to share it, but anyway, that was a whole story in and of itself.
Yeah, I want to hear. Was there some big project that showed up at your door, or like what spawned it?
Well, okay, kind of. So it's again about me being a bit of a nerd. So I hung out with Kevin Kime, who runs the Charles Moore Foundation. And so the Charles Moore Foundation, are y'all familiar with the Charles Moore Foundation here in town? Oh, wow. So Charles Moore was a famous architect that taught at a lot of universities around the country. He's one of the people that kicked off the entire postmodern era of architecture. He's that prominent. And he was teaching at UT. And when he was at UT, he ended up building a house. And then when he died, and you know Anderson Wise Architects? I'm sure y'all are familiar with
that name. Yes, I've heard that name. I've never worked with them.
Well, Anderson Wise grew out of Charles Moore's firm. So Charles Moore partnered with Arthur Anderson. Anyway, that's a whole different story. Anyway, Charles Moore died. He had this house that needed to be maintained, and Kevin Kime, who maintained the house, did all these architectural events and would have people coming over to give talks and that sort of thing. So I heard that there was this house being done in Austin by a famous architect out of California named Donald Linden. And Donald Linden was one of Charles Moore's early partners and was one of the grandfathers of American postmodernism in architecture. So of course I wanted to go hear Donald Linden speak about this, go hear him speak. And then when I went there, it turns out he was giving a talk about the very house he was working on in Austin that I'd also been curious to know more about. So I was like, oh, wow, I get to hear Donald Linden speak, and I get to hear about this house that's being built in Austin by this famous architect. It's like a twofer. Anyway, and the owner of that house, Donald Linden's client, was there with his wife, and I went up, and Donald Linden ended up talking about architecture generally. He didn't talk about the project. So I was disappointed that I didn't get to hear about the project, but that's okay because the owner was there, and I got to go up and say, "I'm so excited that y'all are doing this house in Austin. I'd love to kind of see the plans, or I'd love to see what y'all are doing sometime." And believe it or not, this fellow, he contacted me. Somehow, I guess I told him I worked at Heather McKinney's office, and he followed up with me and said, "Hey, I've got the plans. I'd be happy to show them to you." And so he and I went and had coffee. I got to look at the plans. He's a total architecture nerd. And he and I ended up doing these little, weekend trips to Houston to go look at architecture. And then we went to Dallas to go look at architecture, and total architecture nerd. He was a lot older than I was, kind of further, made his money in banking and finance. But we just became really close friends and architecture buddies. And then at one point I remember thinking, oh, he's always talking about wanting to do a downtown house. I'll go and do my homework and see if there's a plan if there's an idea I can come up with to convince him to maybe think about doing that more seriously. And while I decided I was going to do that, he said, hey, have you ever thought about doing a project downtown? He was the one who brought it up while we were driving back from Houston. So he was already a step ahead of me, already mapping out a path for us to get to do architecture together. And as a result, it got more serious, and he ended up being essentially an investor to help us start an architecture firm that was originally called Weber Hanslick. His name is Willard Hanslick. Weber Hanslick was our original firm, and his own house project that Donald Linden was the main architect for was behind schedule and needed help. So in addition to him being interested in starting the firm, he actually did bring a big project, to answer your other question, for us to start working on. I'm rambling all over the place. I'm sure this is so interesting. So anyway, we did get to work on this big project, and that had a whole bunch of interesting stuff about it. We did a really cool design for this guest house at one point that was very much in the vein of what we ultimately were going to start doing as a firm. And Donald Linden, I actually think it was a really good design, but Donald Linden didn't like it. And I think he didn't like it because it was good and it was not his. I think it was one of those cases, but maybe not. I mean, I still look in retrospect, I still I think it was a good design. So anyway, we ended up not doing that. He changed the design and he moved it to a different part. And actually it still is on our website. We're real proud of the project that was done. And it really was subordinate to what he was trying to do. So I'm glad for that, because it needed to be subordinate to the main house. Anyways, that was the beginning of my firm. And 6 years into it, we discovered that Willard he liked the idea of being an architecture firm, but it's not, as we've talked about, it's not a lot of fun to be an architecture firm sometimes. It's work, and he just wasn't as involved as he thought he was going to be. And so ultimately he just said, why don't you buy me out, and you got this, go for it. So here we are.
So about 6 years in, you changed over to Weber Studio?
That's right. And we've been Weber Studio ever since, and growing. And I was going to say, there's a whole lot there. Like, we're always I'm actively at this point in my life where I'm trying to build in, create in the firm ascension for other people. I've been trying to bring on the right people as partners for the last few years. And I feel lucky. We have some really great folks here that I think are going to take the firm to its next iteration as a firm. So that's exciting.
So what does your longevity look like here? How long do you want to keep doing architecture before you just go travel the world and, do something fun and actually retire?
I'm not going to retire. I mean, my problem is I actually love this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm ever I mean, Oscar Niemeyer, that's your problem too. Oscar Niemeyer did architecture until he died. And Frank Gehry's in his 90s and he's still doing it. And I get that. Like, I love this stuff. I'm never going to stop. I need to slow down. And right now that is the plan is, I've been working very hard to develop a firm that has the right structure in place so that people can propagate what we're about in their own ways, in their own kind of voice and language. So that's how we're structured. And we've spent a lot of time and money and energy developing a structure set up like that. And I've been grooming a handful of people for several years in some cases. And for some people, we have some people that are fairly new that I'm like, you are promising as all get out. I'm targeting some people at being the next generation for the firm as well. So we're trying to build in, our longevity with the team we've got and then with the systems we've got. And that's been enriching and exciting. Although if you ask one of my lead people, you'll also hear I'm extremely impatient because I'm like, I want it done now. And, we're spending too much time and money not having it yet, but that's ultimately the goal probably is that Ransom and I spend half of the year or more living in Italy, or we're looking at Spain, Italy, where we spend a good part of our year abroad, but just working remotely and fewer hours. And we tested that out last year in Italy, and it worked pretty well. So we're starting to look at how to do this, because I do want to do it until I die. I mean, it's always going to be enriching to be somewhere lovely and be able to design and look at technical, and stay involved with the firm, even though I don't have to run it myself. So that's the long-term plan. It's not going to be a, retirement, go grab my Social Security check and go and drink Mai Tais. It's just not me. So.
Yeah.
Are you still actively involved with clients on projects, or does your team kind of run all the projects and you're just involved kind of on the back end of, just overseeing day-to-day type operations, or what does that look like for you?
That's a great question, because the answer is a little bit of a mix.
Yeah.
God, that's a great question. For my intent always was that I could back out of that part almost entirely. And a few years ago, we sort of prematurely tested that out, and it didn't go very well. And unfortunately, I had to come back and get a lot more involved in stuff for a period. And I'm very involved in a whole handful of projects, but there are a lot of projects where I don't even know what the design, I have no idea what's going on the project. I can't remember the clients' names. And the fact that we have a few projects that are running smoothly with that setup is a huge success. But I ultimately, there's some I'm still involved with, but ultimately I would like to set it up so everybody knows exactly what we're about, and they can do it so well that they just don't need me involved, other than, to add a little spice or to give them some guidance on, here's a difficult problem and here's a way to handle it. I almost want to be more of just an emeritus sort of role. And ultimately, and so I'm already trying to put that in practice today, even though the reality is I'm still very involved with a lot of client meetings in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And I'm still very involved in technical detailing on some things. I'm very involved in materials selections. And part of that is because what we do is so detailed and complex that even if I'm not needed for the client, I'm still often the one there to say, hey, remember, this is one important value. We still really need to push this value on this detail we've got. And those material choices, those look beautiful, but I don't care about beauty. I care about regionalism and functionalism. And are they doing those things? So I'm here often to just keep the accountability of what we do high. But my favorite part is the number of people in the firm that are now holding me accountable to our own values. That's a huge sign of success, when they're the ones saying, but David, does this meet this objective we have? That's when I feel like I've been succeeding. So
yeah. Do you feel like since your name is on the door, that automatically makes, whether it be typically clients, want to bring you in, when there's something that comes up in a project, it's like, well, let's ask David. Let's ask David what he thinks, or let's get David involved. Do you feel like, since you were kind of the founding architect?
I don't feel I am the founding architect. I don't feel that way. I never have. That's why it was really important for me to always have the name be Weber Studio, Weber Plus Studio. In fact, we have a whole team of people around us now that refer to the firm as Weber. And that always, I'm like, no, it's not Weber. It's the studio. Yeah. It's the studio. I always talk about it being the studio. I'm somewhat irrelevant. I mean, it's good to have a name, because I did bring the vision, and it's good to have a name. But so I actually don't feel like it's important from my point of view. But I have discovered along the way that a lot of clients are here because they do want me involved, as you said. And whenever we feel like that's a critical piece, we'll have me involved, but typically we'll try and set their expectation that I'm kind of involved with everything, whether the teams want me to be or not. So they feel like they're going to get me. What's that?
You're like, I'm always here. I'm always part of the mix.
I'm always the ghost in the background. And actually, a lot of our clients are perfectly okay with that, which is great. And that's also a sign of success, that they trust the teams to represent what we're about enough that they don't need me specifically there. So, but periodically we have projects where they need me specifically, and I always feel a little bit like that can feel like a prison, because the whole goal of having a group is that it's not all hanging on you. Are y'all still, I mean, y'all don't have, is Mrs. or Mrs. Etch available, please? I would like to speak to Ms. Etch.
Well, I mean, the firm we came from, because we were with Laura Britt for many, many years, we saw that same type of situation rise quite frequently, where the clients would come because they wanted Laura on the project. And, she was spread so thin between trying to be involved in all of the projects. We saw that, and we immediately knew that was not the direction that we wanted to go. So we intentionally made the name Etch, not having one of our names. Go ahead.
Plus, we decided Nelson Lindsey sounded like a law firm and not an interior design firm. So
I wonder. I mean, there are a lot of law firms that are names, and there are a lot of interior design firms that are names.
Yeah.
Do you ever regret having? I mean, I have to admit, what I like about Weber Studio is that there's the generic part of the name that people feel comfortable with. Mm-hmm. But I'm discovering as I get older how old school the world is. People sort of like a name. And if it's a generic name, like Etch is not generic. I mean, it's a nice name for your firm.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of monikers out there where it's a word, it's not a person's name. Do you ever feel like, do you ever regret that? Or do you feel like it's been okay?
But I always feel like it's felt right. Like it's never felt like an odd name. And we went with design group too, because we envisioned that it was going to be kind of a collective of people, not just, Steph, not just me, or us together. It was kind of a collective of people. And so that was kind of the thought process in creating the name in the first place. And Etch kind of holds a special place for us because, when you etch something, it's like permanent, it's like etched in stone, etched in your memory, etched, is like a physical, tangible thing. So it always felt right to us. And I think the second that we landed on that name, it's ironic, funny story. The second that we landed on that name, we both felt really right about it. And we said, okay, we've gone through a million names in trying to figure out what this is going to be. Let's sleep on it tonight. We'll come back to it tomorrow and we'll make a final decision. So we go back the next day and the website Etch Design Group was bought, and it was not bought the day before. We're like, are you kidding me? Overnight.
I hate them.
How does that happen?
And this was before Siri or Alexa could hear everything you're talking about and go and do stuff.
Yep.
Oh my God.
So anyway,
my husband actually tracked down who bought it because they weren't actually going to use the domain. It was just another place that purchased it. And he reached out to them directly, and they emailed back and said, sure, we'll sell it to you. So
and I think we actually bought it cheaper through them
than what it was originally.
The company that was actually selling it the day before. So it all worked out.
So they took a loss on it.
I think they bought a bulk,
a bundle
sites, and so
okay.
Anyway, yeah, but that's the story.
Well, I have to say, I've always been concerned, not concerned. I've always felt a harder time to connect to name. Like when I see a firm's name that's in 3 letters, like CDG or GLK, I don't really know what those letters mean. It's one of those non-words. And then when I see, there are a lot of firms nowadays that sound like rock bands. I don't really get it. I do think design is still very much an individual vision that's often brought to life, and so I do think individual names are powerful in design firms. However, if you're going to have a more a non-specific human name. I've actually always loved y'all's firm name, Etch Design. I've
Oh,
always thought
thank
it was a
you.
great name. Yeah. So
Thank you.
it's beautiful. And it does give you the freedom not to, if it's not Jessica Nelson and Stephanie Lindsey, it also gives you the freedom not to be in that trap where it can always be transitioned to, you never know who the names are behind it. It gives you a lot of growth potential.
Right.
How many people are y'all? Look, I'm going to start asking y'all questions.
Yeah. Right now we're 10. We're bringing on 2 new designers in a couple weeks, so we'll be at 12. How about you?
That is
you have a lot as
well. I think we're 32 or 34 or something. But a lot of there's a whole yet another long story around all that. But yeah, we're about 32, 34 and spread around the globe. We have a whole bunch of production team and some specialists in South America, New Zealand, South Africa. So we've got a whole team of remote folks that are part of the office.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but 12, I mean, that's big for an interior design firm.
We should have a lunch just on running a business, just the business.
Oh my
portion.
God.
We should have a lunch just on design and architecture. We should, we could keep talking to you for a long time.
Well, maybe I can not yammer on so long.
No, this is great.
So,
thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it so much. And Jess, any last?
Well, I really wanted to ask him our infamous 100 lunches question, because we always have to talk about food on the 100 Lunches podcast. And I feel like you, of all people, have got to have some favorite table memories. And so I just want to know, before we wrap up, what is your favorite table memory?
I got two very funny, two table memories.
Okay, I want to hear them.
One is very design related, so you might appreciate it. So the short one is that every holiday as a family, I loved eating, and I loved having big meals as a family. So whenever we'd have a holiday meal, I would always say, oh, this is the best Thanksgiving dinner ever. This is the best Christmas dinner. We're the Jewish family that does Christmas. I would say, this is the best Christmas dinner ever. That was my whole thing, and everybody would sort of laugh and say it along with me because they knew it was so predictably trite as a kid. But one of my funniest memories is, even though I was very adventurous as an eater growing up, one night my mom made liver and onions or something, and we had a rule where I couldn't get dessert. We couldn't get dessert unless we ate our dinner. So we had this very modern house, but we had this red and brown, kind of this reddish deep shag carpet. And when my parents weren't looking, I would eat the liver, I'd chew the liver, and then I would take it out of my mouth and I would drop it under my chair. And it would got lost in the red shag carpet.
Oh my God.
And my parents thought I'd finished my meal. So I got dessert naturally. It wasn't until 2 or 3 days later, when my sister or brother was vacuuming, because we had a chore chart back in those days. It was the 70s. We had chore charts. One of us had to vacuum, and somebody, I think it was my brother vacuuming, discovered all this dried liver under my chair, hidden in the shag carpet. So, see, it's a design can serve. It certainly served me.
100%.
Yeah. So it wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't about the table setting. It wasn't about the lighting. It was about me being able to hide liver in the shag carpet.
That's good.
Sorry you had to hear that, Anita. That was probably a real shock.
I'm going to go on one of our reels later.
Oh my God. I don't know why that popped up. Of all the food memories I have, that was the one.
That was it. Awesome. Well, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it so much, and we just adore you. So
thank you. This was a lot of fun, and I'm sorry I just yammered on and on about stuff. But it was a lot of fun. Thank you.
This was so good.
Awesome.
This was so good.
All right. Thank you.